The head of the RCMP is under more pressure this morning. Commissioner Brenda Lucki facing new questions over racism in Canada's National Police Force and the violent encounters between RCMP and Indigenous Canadians that have been making headlines. After a backlash earlier this month, Commissioner Lucki now concedes there is systemic racism in the RCMP. But she's now looking at more criticism this morning after speaking to a Commons committee last night. We begin this hour with Laura McQuillan and coverage of her testimony on that issue, notably, Laura, of systemic racism.
That's exactly what the Public Safety Committee is looking at here, launching its own look at the wider issue, and that of course comes against the backdrop of protests over the police action or inaction towards racialised Canadians. Also those violent encounters we've been reporting on in recent weeks between the RCMP and Indigenous men, including several caught on camera and of course the death of Rodney Levi, shot dead by the RCMP in New Brunswick just a couple of weeks ago. Now Brenda Lucki has in recent weeks flip-flopped on systemic racism in the RCMP when asked if it's an issue. At times she has said that she's struggled to define what systemic racism is. She told the Globe and Mail she did not believe that there was systemic racism in the RCMP. Since then she's backtracked. She said she acknowledges there is systemic racism in the force, but yesterday when she was speaking to the Public Safety Committee, she had an exchange with Liberal MP Greg Fergus. He asked her about that and he asked her for some examples of what it looks like, and here's the response she gave. It wasn't quite what MPs expected.
Yes, there's absolutely systemic racism. I can give you a couple of examples. We have a physical abilities a requirement evaluation. It's an obstacle course. In there, there's a 6-foot mat that you have to do a broad jump. And there are people in all different cultures that may not be 6 feet, including there's not a lot of women that are 6 feet tall.
Be systemic discrimination, but I'm trying to think of systemic racism.
In our, we have some questions, for example, in our aptitude test. And you know what, I might refer Gail, because that is Gail's specialty.
Now, the Gail that she referred to was the head of human resources for the RCMP, Gail Johnson, who then gave an answer saying the RCMP has made changes to the way it recruits people from the north because there had been some issues in getting recruits who were able to travel to do the test or who had driver's licenses. So some changes there, she says, to improve things. In terms of systemic racism, no current examples given, and certainly that example from Brenda Lucki of some recruits not being tall enough to do a jump adequately on an obstacle course will not stack up for critics who are expecting better answers than that when it comes to systemic racism in the RCMP, Heather.
Laura, the Commissioner also asked about the future of policing and specifically about the calls we're now hearing across the province to defund the police and divert some of that money in part to things like mental health supports. A lot of the testimony dealt with the number of mental health calls that Mounties and members face, and it was pretty eye-opening how she described that situation.
That's right. She described how there has been a spike in mental health calls that the RCMP have been going out to, some 10,000 a month, which she described as an exponential increase. Now, as you mentioned with those calls to defund the police, there have been people saying that mental health professionals should be attending those wellness checks instead of police officers who may be armed and who may have a confrontation with the person at the centre of that call out. But Brenda Lucki defended the way that police respond to those mental health calls with this.
It's so important that the first response when a person is in crisis, and I have said at 3 o'clock in the morning when somebody's wielding a knife and they're suffering from a mental health crisis, that is not the time to bring in mental health practitioners. It's time for the RCMP to go in, get that person calm, get them to a place of safety and get them the help they need. So it's not about defunding, it's about funding everything that goes along. And I think we can work better with our mental health practitioners.
Now, while critics wouldn't disagree that there could be better cooperation between police and mental health services, they may disagree on her point about it being appropriate timing for the police to go in when they receive those call-outs. And certainly MPs have been calling for better answers in the wake of what they heard last night, Heather.
Laura McQuillan, thank you very much.